guy named Timothy Dees, 26 years old, disappeared from Madison County on February 27th of this year and hasn't been found yet. He lived in Crevker, Missouri, and worked as a stage rigger for 6 years at St. Louis Local 6. He did this job at different places in St. Louis. His family said Timothy really enjoyed setting up concerts and working with the stage lights. His mom, Barbara Hall, last saw him on Friday, February 25th when he left her house in Jefferson County. He was heading to Fredericktown in Madison County with his childhood friend, Caleb Nanny, to hang out for the weekend. When Timothy didn't get in touch with his mom over the weekend, she started getting worried. He usually called or texted her to let her know he was fine. It was his routine to stay in touch with his mom a lot after his brother died because he knew she'd worry about him. Since Barbara couldn't reach him all weekend and Timothy didn't have voicemail set up, she couldn't leave a message. This was normal for Timothy, so no surprise there. But when she tried texting his phone, the text didn't go through and she knew something was wrong. Around 1 a.m. in the early morning hours on Monday, February 28th, Timothy was last seen on surveillance in a local gas station in Fredericktown. He withdrew $160 and proceeded to play the slot machines. He looked alive and well and not in distress, according to the sheriff's department. 3 hours later, around 4:40 a.m., a 911 call comes into the Madison County Dispatch Center. According to the dispatch, the 911 quarter was down in December of the previous year, and a new one was not installed until the middle of March the next year. After the call, Barbara said that deputies responded to a house on Village Creek Road in Madison County, where the 911 call originated from. There, they proceeded to arrest the friend that Timothy had been traveling with on warrants. Barbara goes on to state that the deputies never questioned the residents about Timothy's whereabouts, even though they knew he was reported missing. According to Barbara, Madison County Sheriff's Department has been no help. Kathy McCutcheon, the sheriff, says that her department has addressed every lead. She states that she's been working with the Missouri Highway State Patrol and assisted them in the investigation. A few days after Timothy's disappearance, Barbara received a call from Caleb, the friend that Timothy left to go to Fredericktown for the weekend, via a video conference call from jail. Unprompted, Caleb proceeds to tell Barbara that he would never hurt Timothy and that he would do everything he could to find him. Barbara said that Caleb had not been any help because his story kept changing every time she spoke with him. Barbara is still adamant that the Madison County Sheriff's Department has done nothing to help with the investigation. Barbara travels to Madison County daily to distribute flyers and speak with residents. There are a lot of unanswered questions about Timothy's disappearance that Barbara would like answered. One of the questions is why deputies did not inquire about Timothy's whereabouts when they were dispatched to the residence after the 911 call was made. Anyone with information is asked to contact the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department. What do you think about it? Tell us your thoughts in comments below. Let's continue. Before we proceed, I've got an exciting surprise for you. We've launched a brand new channel dedicated to intriguing content such as old historical mysteries, cold cases, and particularly chilling horror stories perfect for bedtime. Drop a comment letting us know if you're a fan of horror stories or not. You can find the link in the description below. Let's find out who will be the first to explore it. Alright, let's dive back into the video. On March 10th, 1987, Daniel Morgan, a Welsh private investigator in London, went for a drink with his business partner Jonathan Rees at the Golden Lion pub in Sydenham. Daniel, 37, and Rees sat at the pub and had a single drink each. They departed shortly after, going their separate ways around 9 p.m. 40 minutes later, a man found Daniel in the parking lot of the pub on the ground. Daniel was declared deceased at the scene, with the murder weapon, a hatchet, still embedded in his head. It was a gruesome murder and one that had shocked locals in the area. Daniel Morgan's family had also immediately been concerned about the coming investigation. Daniel's brother knew that he'd been working on a case regarding police corruption, and it had been immediate concern that someone within the local police force had caught wind. No one had come forward as a witness despite several pleas from the media. The hatchet had been a common general store make and model without any unique identifiers, but the killer had placed 2 bandages around the handle to act as a grip. Initially, the case was assigned to Sid Fiery, a detective sergeant at the Catford police station, and he had the collection of the crime scene evidence, the initial witness statements, and documenting the process. Months later, it was revealed that Fiery had been working with Jonathan Reeves. Fiery had been the one to interrogate Reeves, but hadn't disclosed that the two were friends. After which, Fiery, Reeves, and two other police officers, along with Reeves' brother-in-laws, were arrested but later released. Fiery was removed from the case, but he resigned from the police department altogether and joined Reeves in replacing Daniel Morgan in the private investigation business. There had been several allegations that Daniel and Jonathan were having several differences of opinion regarding the business. Reeves was very well connected with the police department, whereas Daniel kept his distance. Daniel didn't trust the police department, concerned about corruptions within the ranks. One witness stated that Reeves had conspired to have Daniel murdered to get him out of the business, even revealing that Sid Fiery had been brought in to replace Daniel once he was taken care of. Reeves and Fiery denied this conversation took place, but it is what happened after Daniel's murder. The statements were deemed as not corroborated as there had been no additional witnesses, and the witness who made the statement was under investigation for fraud and therefore deemed not reputable. Months later, a former employer came forward saying that Daniel had approached him about asking for help selling a story to the newspaper about police corruption, solidifying the belief that Daniel was killed because of the article he was working on. In 1989, Jonathan Reeves was arrested a second time for the murder of Daniel Morgan, and this time he was charged. However, the charges were eventually dropped. Meanwhile, the Morgan family were continuing to keep the case in the media and keep pressuring lawmakers and detectives and papers to keep the case alive. Detectives decided to set up surveillance within the office of Reeves and Fiery. They discovered that the two were working closely with tabloid newspapers, and their clientele became less than honest. The two were hired by a man to plant drugs on his ex-wife before a custody hearing, so his ex-wife would be deemed an unfit parent by the courts and he wouldn't have to pay child support. It hadn't been the evidence they were looking for, but law enforcement had to intervene and blow the undercover surveillance operation. Reeves was arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit a crime and sentenced to 7 years in prison. Over the passing decades, the case remains unsolved. Reeves is now out of prison, but is still suspect to have been involved in Daniel Morgan's murder. The Metropolitan Police have been under incredible scrutiny since this case. Several audits have revealed deep and systematic corruption within law enforcement that really hasn't been addressed. Reeves had deep connections and had help from officers. Fiery had been a detective for many years, and in addition to knowing police protocols, was also well connected. The undercover surveillance had revealed one instance where they'd been willing to commit a crime in order to make a buck. And that surveillance had happened years after Reeves and Fiery had gone into business together. It wouldn't be a stretch to conclude that they might have done this before. In that case, two officers had also been arrested in connection with the crime for planting the drugs on an innocent woman. Those aren't the kind of officers you want investigating the man who was murdered for trying to bring to light corrupt officers. In 2021, Morgan's brother Alastair is still raising awareness and meeting with law enforcement to try and get action taken. In a recent report expressing concerns about the corruption within the Metropolitan Police, they said, "The family of Daniel Morgan suffered grievously as a consequence of the failure to bring his family justice. The unwarranted assurances which were given, the misinformation which was put into the public domain, and the denial of failings on the investigation, including failing to acknowledge professional competence, individuals' penal behavior, and managerial and organizational failures. The Metropolitan Police have also repeatedly failed to take a fresh, thorough, and critical look at past failings, concealing or denying failings for the sake of the organization's public image, is dishonesty on the part of the organization for a reputational benefit and constitutes a form of institutional corruption." Shane McLaughlin was just 15 years old when he first went missing from his mother's home in Romulus, Michigan in Metro Detroit. He was eventually found and returned, but then decided to move in with a relative to attend high school. He was last seen leaving his residence at 10:48 on the evening of October 28, 2020. He was captured on camera getting into a dark-colored SUV, possibly a Dodge Jeep or Durango, and had a Nike duffel bag with him. Shane has a heartbeat tattoo on the side of his left arm, and both ears pierced. On October 18, 2021, Crime Stoppers and the team's family marked the first anniversary since anyone had seen or heard from the teen. Crime Stoppers of Michigan was offering a $2,500 reward for any information. Shane's mother, Nicole Quarles, is seen on TV, tearfully asking for just a phone call from her son to let her know that he is safe. Not to return home, but just to call. Shane then surfaced in a TikTok video. The video showed Shane with his missing poster in the background and a medical mask on, alleging he left home because he was physically and emotionally abused. In the TikTok video, he claimed that he'd suffered from mental issues since he was 14, and when he asked for help from his mother, she would tell him to get over it. The TikTok videos have since been removed. According to Shane, he alerted police and child services about the abuse, and he alleged that no one would help him, so he chose to leave on his own, saying in the video, "I'm doing great on my own. I'm doing fine. I don't need nobody. You guys might think because I'm young, I need someone to rely on, but I don't. I'm perfectly capable of living by myself. There's no one that I need in life. I just want to be alone." Quarles then acknowledged in her own TikTok video that this is indeed her son, but denied the abuse claims. She stated that Shane had been counseling for anxiety but was experiencing difficulties at home. She said that she believes he has been brainwashed and she fears for his life and will not stop looking for him. Quarles said that she and the police know the woman that is helping Shane. She lives near Quarles, and Quarles had taken out a personal protection order against the woman. Quarles said that despite the court order, the older woman had not kept her distance from her so that court action would take place. She stated that if Shane agrees to meet with the police so that they can determine his well-being, she will call off the search. She has stated that she believes that Shane was groomed by the older woman and that the two have been in some sort of relationship. According to the Romulus police, Shane is still considered a voluntary missing person. Law enforcement have stated that there isn't any evidence to prove Shane was abused nor his siblings. However, they have stated that once Shane turns 18, he will not be required to return to his family, but they would like him to reach out so that they can make sure he's okay. As of right now, the case remains open. This case is kind of unique, but because Shane is still a minor and given his age and the allegations made on both sides, it is paramount that law enforcement know he is okay and that there wasn't anything criminal with his disappearance. Anyone with information is asked to contact the Romulus Police Department. Krista Abelseth was 16 years old when she was sexually assaulted by the then 30-year-old John Barnes. Krista said she'd been drinking with Barnes and had suddenly become very tired and intoxicated. The last thing she remembered was being offered a ride home. However, Krista awoke naked on the bathroom floor in Barnes' home. She hadn't been conscious during the sexual assault and had become pregnant as a result. She didn't initially report the assault as she didn't know the laws around filing police reports. Bearing in mind, she was also only 16. However, when she was seeking therapy in 2015, she was informed that she still was within the window to report the crime, which she did. Krista didn't inform her attacker that she had kept the child and raised her child as a single parent for 5 years before Barnes learned of the child and immediately sought to custody of the little girl. Then Krista recently lost custody when she gave her daughter a cell phone, which had been prohibited by the judge. The daughter, now 16, brought forward allegations that her father had sexually, physically, and emotionally abused her. Krista was back in court to request full custody, which was also the teen's wish. Initially, the request was denied due to insufficient evidence despite evidence from the hospital confirming that the child was not a child, that the 16-year-old had injuries consistent with sexual assault. Barnes also stopped allowing Krista to visit or communicate with her child. This is when Krista took to the media, alleging that the courts were protecting a known child predator and was a danger to her child. The story garnered international attention, demanding criminal action. On July 15th, the judge on the case ordered that the teen be placed in the care of a third party while he looked into the sexual assault allegations from both Krista and her daughter. The age of consent in Louisiana is 17, and due to Krista's age when she gave birth, no matter what the circumstances had been, it was illegal and should have been investigated during the initial custody trial. Also, Barnes was held in contempt of the courts during that hearing and ordered to pay Krista's legal fees for not allowing her to communicate with her daughter. So far, there have been no updates from the courts, even though there was supposed to be a verdict on July 15th regarding the custody arrangement. But the courts couldn't come to a decision, so it's being pushed to a later date. We don't know when the next court dates are, but it is hopeful that Krista is reunited with her daughter. In California, the Gem and Jewelry Show was getting ready to move the event to the Pasadena Convention Center in San Mateo. It is a traveling convention that features rare private collections for display. And during the move on July 11th, all of the precious wares were loaded onto an armored vehicle driven by Brinks Security. The contents of the vehicle have an estimated combined value of over $100 million. Stepped away from the vehicle at a rest stop and left the truck unattended for 27 minutes. When they came back, the vehicle had been robbed. The thieves are alleged to have bypassed the vehicle's locking system. Specifics haven't been released, so as to not jeopardize the safety of other vehicles in the fleet. Initially, it was reported that the loss was less than $10 million in value, but it is now being discovered that several of the collectors had underinsured their jewels because insuring these items is incredibly expensive. The owners impacted aren't huge corporations. They are usually individuals or families that rent out the items to trade shows to not only share the items with the public, but it also helps to cover the costs of insuring them. The Gem and Jewelry Show has been operating for years and has never had an issue before. They have also exclusively worked with Brinks to secure the items and have never had any issues. This is an ongoing investigation, and I'm sure we're going to hear more about this later. Stephanie Isaacson, who had been murdered in a random attack while she was walking to school. Her case was solved after 32 years thanks to the generous donation that funded the advanced genetic genealogy testing that had been instrumental in solving the case. Her killer, Darren Roy Marchand, had committed suicide 9 years after the slaying. His DNA profile had also connected him to another unsolved cold case. He had been a longtime Las Vegas resident, but had never been a suspect in either case. The generous donation had been provided by local businessman Justin Wu, who has since gone on to fund several more cases. And similar to the identification of Darren Roy Marchand, Wu's funding has closed 2 cold cases, both perpetrated by the same killer, and possibly another 5. Because of this donation, the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department may have identified a serial killer active in the area in the 70s and 80s. The first case that was solved was that of Kim Bryant, a 16-year-old who was abducted from a Dairy Queen parking lot on January 26, 1979. The Dairy Queen was across the street from her high school, and she was waiting there for her boyfriend to pick her up. When he arrived, he noted that Kim was nowhere to be seen, but didn't think too much of it. Kim had been abducted around 9 a.m. and wasn't reported missing until late afternoon when she didn't return home from school. An extensive investigation of the teen was conducted, but there had been little to go on. Officers had one witness who said they saw Kim waiting and then saw 2 young males drive past, talk to her for a moment, and then drive away shouting obscenities at her. Those young men had never been identified, but officers had the make and model of the vehicle. Additionally, they also released a sketch to the media. A month after her disappearance, 3 boys made a grisly discovery while hiking. Kim's body was discovered in a desert area in a shallow grave. She had been brutally beaten, sexually assaulted, and the cause of her death was noted as blunt force trauma. The investigation went on for several months, but eventually, leads dried up and the case went cold. Law enforcement from the original investigation had preserved a DNA sample, and it was kept in storage for many years, but over time the sample began to degrade, making it more challenging to extract a full DNA profile using modern equipment. In 2021, while re-examining the evidence, they found a new sample on Kim's clothing and were able to get a full DNA profile and upload it into the national databases. This had renewed hopes of finding her killer, and it had been the first time they were able to get a full profile for comparison. Unfortunately, there were no hits. In 2021, after the success of finding Stephanie Isaacson's killer, Justin Wu offered to fund more cases, covering the costly expense of sending DNA samples to private labs in order to have an advanced genetic genealogy profile done. Kim's case would be one of those in the next round of cold cases to be sent off to Othram Labs. It took nearly a year, but finally Othram was able to narrow in on several close relatives of the suspect. In October 2021, LVMPD reached out to the closest relative and asked for a DNA sample to compare, and that relative agreed to submit their DNA for comparison. It was in November 2021 they finally had an identification. Kim Bryant's killer had been Johnny Blake Peterson, who had been 19 at the time of Kim's murder. Johnny had also attended the same high school as Kim, but he graduated a few years before she did, and it was unclear if the two knew each other. Peterson had never been identified as a suspect, however. He had been arrested for sexual assault, but never convicted, and it appeared the case against him had been dropped. Peterson lived in Las Vegas his whole life. He worked in construction as a plasterer and a general contractor. He had married and had 2 children, but died under mysterious circumstances in 1993 at the age of 32. His cause of death could not be determined. When LVMPD uploaded Peterson's DNA into the national databases, they were surprised when his DNA matched another cold case from Las Vegas. On December 31, 1983, 22-year-old Diana Hansen was abducted while jogging in western Las Vegas. Diana was a college student from Texas visiting family over the winter break. Similar to Kim's abduction, it had been quick without any witnesses. She had been reported missing later that day, but maybe because of her age and that she wasn't a resident, or that it was New Year's Eve, there wasn't as large of an immediate sense of urgency with the investigation that we saw with Kim's. There is barely any information about her disappearance available. The following day, her body was discovered in another remote area near where she'd been abducted. She had been sexually assaulted, but in escalation of violence from Kim's murder, Diana had been stabbed to death. Diana's murder investigation quickly went cold. No one in the area had seen anything suspicious, and it wasn't clear exactly where Diana was jogging, so they couldn't even narrow down where they would be looking for an abduction. There was little evidence to go on, and the case had remained unsolved for decades. It had only taken a week from Johnny Peterson's identification as Kim Bryant's killer for Diana's cold case to be solved. LVMPD is looking at 5 other cold cases that have similar patterns as Kim and Diana's cases. They believe Peterson could be linked to several more killings, with a wide time frame of 1975 to 1993, opening up the possibility that Peterson could have been a serial killer in the area. Christina Burlingame, Eve Provenzano, Terry Dietrich, and Mary Beth DeVito were all young women who had been abducted and murdered in the same window of time. Before we continue, 90% of you haven't subscribed to our channel, so if you like this video, please subscribe. It motivates us to make more content for you. Okay, let's continue. On July 31, 1974, 22-year-old Christy Ellen Bryant had been working an overnight shift alone at a 7-Eleven store in National City, a city within the San Diego region. Christy was from Florida and had come to California to serve in the U.S. Marine Corps. An injury sustained in a car accident in 1972 had ended her military career. Christy was described as a very friendly person who was always willing to lend a hand where needed. Sometime in the early morning hours, Christy was attacked. Her body was found hours later when the next worker arrived and discovered the front doors to the convenience store were locked. He then discovered Christy's body covered in blood. Her cause of death was determined to have been several stab wounds, but based on the evidence, it appeared that Christy had put up one hell of a fight. They determined a significant amount of blood from her attacker at the scene. Despite an exhaustive investigation, no suspects were identified for nearly 5 decades. There had been no witnesses and nothing to aid in the investigation. In 2008, the suspect's DNA was uploaded to the national databases, but no leads were generated from that. In 2012, 2015, and 2016, detectives tested the DNA against all California databases from their Department of Justice, hoping to get a familial match, but again, nothing came up. The case was passed on to San Diego's Cold Case Investigation Unit, and with the help of grant funding, they were able to submit the DNA for advanced genetic genealogy testing. In the fall of 2021, they identified a suspect, 69-year-old Carlin Edward Cornet. They surveilled him and collected a sample of DNA for comparison and were able to connect him to Christy's killer. He was extradited to San Diego, where he is pleaded not guilty. Cornet had never been a suspect in the slaying, nor did he have any criminal history. At this time, it is unclear when his next trial date is. Christie's father and sister made a statement to the media. Her sister has vowed to attend every court date Cornet has. Holly Bryant stated to the media, "I do want him to pay for what he did, and I hope his family can accept it as well." Back in 1975 in New Smyrna, Florida, a young couple, Tina Gail Lynn, 17, and Dean Klaus, 21, tied the knot. They were high school sweethearts and soon had a daughter named Holly. After Holly was born, they decided to move to Texas for Dean's construction job. They said goodbye to their families and headed off to Texas. At first, they kept in touch a lot, but then the calls and letters stopped in April 1980. It didn't seem odd at first, but then Dean's family got a weird call. A woman named Sister Susan from Los Angeles claimed to know about Tina and Dean and had Dean's car. She wanted $1,000 to bring the car back to Florida. The car had been purchased by Donna and gifted to Dean for the move. Donna agreed to meet the woman, but also alerted authorities. They agreed to meet at the Daytona racetrack. The Klaus family was confused when 3 women in white robes, possibly one male, stepped out of the vehicle and did not want to be contacted by family members. She further stated that the couple had given up all of their possessions. The women were reportedly taken into custody, but no police report of the incident was ever found, and because the couple were adults, no investigation was taken at that time. Donna stated that she hadn't been surprised that Dean had joined a cult. He had expressed interest and had been involved in a different cult in Florida, but she thought that he'd put it past him when he married Tina. After this encounter, no one heard from Tina or Dean ever again. It was in 1981 in Houston, Texas, when 2 bodies were discovered in a wooded area. It was a man and woman found in a shallow grave buried together. The cause of death was deemed to be homicide. The man appeared to have been beaten to death, while the woman had injuries consistent with strangulation, and in the grave was a bloody towel and green gym shorts. They estimated that they had been killed 2 months before the discovery. The bodies had no identification, and there weren't any missing person report that matched. Composite sketches were done and released to the media, but no one came forward. The bodies remained unidentified for decades. They were buried in the Harris County and were given the names Harris County Jane and John Doe. In 2021, Texas established a dedicated statewide cold case unit for the first time to start going through the 20,000 unsolved murders in the state. The cold case team started accepting cases in the fall of 2021, and one of the first cases they decided to open was that of the Harris County Jane and John Doe. They first decided to have the bodies exhumed in order to get DNA samples from the 2 of them, and soon the bodies were identified as Tina and Dean Klaus, who had been missing since 1981. Law enforcement started their investigation, which led them to speak to the families of the deceased. Very quickly, they learned that the couple had a young daughter, and a search began to find baby Holly. Dean's mother said that she was devastated to learn that Dean and Tina had been murdered so soon after they stopped communication. Though she had missed her son over the years, she had hoped the family had been living out their lives, but had always feared the worst. Both Tina's family and Dean's family had never given up hope that they might one day have answers. Law enforcement from multiple agencies set to work trying to find Holly, and in June 2022 they made the discovery that no one had thought possible. Holly Klaus, now 42, was found in Oklahoma. Some details have not been released to protect the ongoing investigation, but it was revealed that shortly after the murder of Tina and Dean, Holly had been left at a church in Arizona and adopted by the pastor and his wife of the church. They had renamed the infant. She never knew her birth name, birth family, or parents. Holly's adopted parents were not suspects. They revealed details about the circumstances that brought Holly to their front door. 2 women dressed in white robes and barefoot. They identified themselves as members of a nomadic religious group. The women spoke about their beliefs, saying that their religion included separating male and female members and practicing vegetarian habits. They also stated that their religion prevented them from wearing leather goods. These group members also indicated that they had previously given up another baby at a laundromat. Experts have identified the group as likely being the nomadic cult called Christ's Family, which had been led by Charles McHugh. The group had been known to wander the southern United States for years and had been active in Texas in 1981. The Texas General's Attorney's Office went on to state that the members of the group are believed to have traveled to Arizona, California, and possibly Texas. The members of the nomadic group had been spotted in Yuma, Arizona during the 1980s, with the female members asking the public for food. McHugh, who called himself Lightning Amen, believed himself to be Jesus reincarnated and at the group's highest had 2,000 members. McHugh encouraged excessive drug use and demanded that members give up their former lives and earthly possessions. Children within the cult were viewed as excessive baggage, and it was required that all children be given up. If Tina and Dean had been involved with this or recruited into this cult, they would have been required to give up Holly, and it is still unknown what led to their deaths. The FBI had noted that this particular group as non-violent, however, the leader was seen as dangerous and unpredictable. McHugh had been arrested in 1985 for possession and transporting methamphetamines for the purpose of sale, as well as weapons charges. At his arrest, he was also found to be in possession of several weapons, various other drugs, and $4,200 in cash. He was convicted along with 4 other followers and went to prison for a bit. Another incident in 1985 was when 10 cult members were arrested for growing over $900,000 worth of cannabis at a compound in California. The cult broke up when McHugh was in prison. When he was released, he had a small following until his death in 2010, though there are still active members of Christ's family. Holly, whose adopted name has been withheld to protect her family's privacy, has 5 children of her own and even is a grandmother. She has been reunited with her birth family, who has welcomed her return. Their reunification is being facilitated by experts. Family members are relieved that Holly had a good life and was well cared for all of these years. The investigation into the murders of Dean and Tina Klaus is still ongoing. Little is known about what may have happened to the couple. Had they refused to give up Polly and was killed by McHugh or other members? The timeline puts a time of murder around the same time the car was returned to Florida. If anyone has information about their deaths, they are asked to please contact the Texas Attorney General's Cold Case and Missing Persons Unit. Nestled at the base of Pikes Peak, a scenic summit in the Rocky Mountains, is Colorado Springs. It's described as a big city with a small-town feel, but the recent murder of 17-year-old Riley Whitelaw has shaken this Midwestern community to its core. Riley was a high school student working part-time at the local Walgreens. She was a talented student that kept a super busy schedule. When she wasn't in class, she was a school color guard member and even found time to volunteer. She was described as a creative person that used several artistic outlets to express herself. She loved painting, writing, dancing, and playing guitar. Not only was she accomplished and bright, but Riley was described as empathetic, compassionate, and wise beyond her years. Riley was tragically robbed of her bright future when she was murdered on June 11th. The story of that day actually began 1 year earlier, when Riley was only 16 years old and started working a couple days a week at her local Walgreens. Riley was said to have liked her job there and got along with her coworkers. However, Riley went to her management team and said that one coworker was making her uncomfortable. 28-year-old Joshua Johnson. She said that Johnson was making several unwanted advances towards her, and she was concerned and wanted it to stop. The store manager, Justin Zunino, told her that he would take the complaint seriously, but only spoke to Johnson asking him to act professional in the workplace. We are talking about a grown man making unwanted sexual advances towards a minor, and all that happened is he was asked politely to stop. No additional precautions were taken to protect Riley. There were no disciplinary actions taken, and Riley was forced to continue working shifts with a man who would continue to harass her. Over the next 9 months, Riley continued working at the store, and it is unclear if the behavior continued from Johnson or if management wasn't doing anything about it. There allegedly weren't any additional formal complaints for a while. I remember when I was 18 and working my first full-time job. It was a job that I worked entirely with much older adults. Almost all of them were men. I had endured months of sexual harassment from a couple of guys that I worked with. When I went to my male manager, he laughed and said I was being sensitive and told me to ignore it. Kept happening, and when I approached the owner about what was happening, all of a sudden, my manager was pissed off at me because I'd gotten him in trouble. After that, my manager basically told all of my coworkers I had tattled on them and I was ruining all the fun. I was essentially bullied relentlessly after that. I was put on shitty shifts, I had my hours cut, and my manager refused to sign off on reporting my hours that I needed for my apprenticeship. I know that my experience is not a unique one. Reporting sexual harassment in any workplace is terrifying. It took me weeks to build up the courage to say something, and in the end it made things 10 times worse. The bullying for reporting the incident was way worse than the initial harassment. I don't know if this happened to Riley exactly, but I know what happens in workplaces. People gossip and people are mean. In March of 2022, Riley's boyfriend Jacob began working at the same Walgreens as Riley. It was at this point that things began to escalate. Crystal Ishmael, another manager at the store, began noticing that Johnson seemed to be acting increasingly jealous. But again, nothing was done about it. There was zero effort made by management to make any changes or protections in place. In late May, Riley approached management again and reported Johnson for unwanted advances that were making her uncomfortable. She specifically stated that things were at the worst when they worked shifts together. Riley asked to not be scheduled with Johnson. It seemed to be a very reasonable request if they weren't willing to do anything else. She made the complaint with the store manager, Justin Zunino. As was seen with the first complaint, no action was taken. When Riley asked not to be scheduled with Johnson, she was told that they could only accommodate her request by cutting her hours and it wasn't possible to schedule them separately. The harassment was so unbearable that Riley accepted the accommodation, but eventually approached management again and that she said she basically begged for more hours. Zunino said he could give her more hours, but she would need to work with Johnson and just deal with it. Riley accepted the schedule change and went back to working night shifts with Johnson. On June 11, 2022, Riley was working the same shift as Johnson. She left for her 30-minute break around 5:30 p.m. She was working a Saturday, so she was likely midway through her shift. For anyone unfamiliar with corporate retail structure, breaks are usually staggered in such a way that they shouldn't disrupt business service. These breaks are usually all pre-planned out and on your schedule, so you know what time approximately you're going to be taking your break. And if you're even a minute late coming back from a break, your manager usually knows about it because that means your coworker can't go on their break and it has a domino effect for the rest of the breaks that day. So to me, this next part makes no sense. Crystal Eichmel noticed that Riley didn't return from her break around 6 p.m. and called Justin Zunino to come back to the store. He quickly returned a few minutes later. Eichmel claimed to have looked all over the store for Riley and had basically assumed she had abandoned her shift, which is a term used for people who leave mid-shift. Zunino decides to check the store's security footage to see if Riley left the building, but instead he finds something much more disturbing. In the video, Zunino saw Joshua Johnson carefully stacking boxes on top of one another until they completely cover their surveillance camera that faced the staff break room, as if he was trying to prevent people from seeing the actions he was about to take. He noted the time when Johnson had started doing this, and it was hours before Riley's disappearance, near the start of his shift. Zunino also noticed that when he returned to the store, someone had taped over the windows to the break room with paper, so that you couldn't directly see inside the break room. Additionally, he noticed a restroom closed sign taped over the door. This was the public washroom, and it was unusual to have that sign up while the store was still open. At the time, he hadn't really thought anything of it or didn't really think it was super important, but while he was watching Johnson cover the cameras, he knew something very wrong had happened. Finally, Zunino went to the break room, being the first person to go there since Riley went on break. Apparently, no one had thought to check the break room when they were searching the whole store for Riley. When he opened the door, he immediately saw Riley on the floor and said that there was blood everywhere. Completely upset and in shock, he did not enter the room and ran out to call 911 at 6:55 p.m. Meanwhile, Crystal Ishmael said that she had been looking around the store for Riley when she noticed a strong odor of bleach coming from the dumpster area. When she attempted to investigate further, a male voice called back and said not to open it or come closer because he was changing. She quickly went to ask Zunino for help, but no one was there when she returned. All that was present was a completely empty bottle of bleach on the ground. Police officers arrived on the scene at 7:02 p.m. According to the police affidavit, Riley had suffered significant trauma to her neck area, and there was a lot of blood around her head and on the floor and other stains on the floor cabinets and counter. Zunino and relayed the information to the police about everything they had seen in the store that day and the camera footage. They also told officers about Johnson's jealous behavior and advances towards the victim. Joshua Johnson was already the prime suspect, but he was nowhere to be found. Officers began taking statements from customers and co-workers and discovered that approximately a customer in the store was shopping in the deodorant aisle when she heard screaming and a slamming noise like a door or locker. Nervous yet unsure of exactly what she'd heard, the lady simply finished her purchase and left the store, only reporting what she had heard after the incidents of the day came to light. But she wasn't the only one who heard that. Several other reports from customers and co-workers reported hearing similar noises, but no one investigated, placing the time of the attack at 5:44 p.m. And even more shocking that no one checked the staff area for over an hour. I have been a manager for many years, and if someone was ever late coming back from break, the first place I would check would be the staff room. Law enforcement finally found Johnson the following day, walking on Interstate 95 near Trinidad, Colorado, over 100 miles from where the crime had occurred. According to the officers who picked him up, Johnson had scratch marks on his face and hands, consistent with defensive wounds. Johnson was promptly picked up without incident and brought in for questioning. He admitted to officers that he'd previously had a crush on Riley, but had not been interested lately because he was in a relationship with Crystal Eichmel. While there is uncertainty as to whether his claim is true, Crystal certainly did not mention this to police, nor did any of the other interviewees. So it's possible Johnson lied about his involvement with her. The improbable claim that he'd been in the break room after Riley had been killed and slipped and fell in her blood, but did not call police and decided to clean himself up. He said that he walked out of the store, went home, and changed his clothes. However, he denied stacking the boxes to cover the camera, despite the clear evidence of this action being seen on video. Joshua Johnson was officially arrested and charged with first-degree murder. He's being held without bail while he waits trial. The investigation is ongoing. Johnson will next be in court on August 26th. While Joshua Johnson is the top suspect and the likely murderer of Riley, news outlets have speculated as to whether he is the only party to blame for Riley's death. Walgreens and her managers there should have done more to protect Riley. Sexual harassment reports should have been taken seriously, and inappropriate behavior, like what Johnson exhibited, should not have been tolerated in the workplace. Riley's safety and well-being were not prioritized by her workplace, and this negligence contributed to her death. Walgreens has not made a public statement about Riley's murder, though they did opt to say that they were providing grief counseling to employees and have closed the store, which as of recording remains closed. It is unclear if any legal action will be taken against the management of the store, or if there will be any broader actions taken by the company to prevent this from happening again. Riley's family has set up a GoFundMe to establish a scholarship in Riley's name. They are hopeful there is swift justice and appreciate the outpouring of support they have received from the community and abroad. Colorado Springs Police Department also encourages anyone with information about this case to call them or make anonymous reports with Crime Stoppers. On January 10, 1984, Patricia Louise Smith, a 51-year-old interior decorator originally from Nebraska, was having lunch at her home in Lakewood, Colorado. She was helping her daughter, who had recently gone through a divorce, settle in with her two young kids. While Patricia's grandchildren were at school and her daughter was at work, she was alone at home. Later that day, when her daughter Sherry waited for her at the park and ride as usual, Patricia didn't show up. This worried Sherry, who waited for a bit before calling her cousin to pick her up. Together, they fetched Sherry's kids and went home. When they arrived, they noticed the house was dark except for the light coming from Patricia's bedroom TV. Inside, they found Patricia lying on the floor, covered with a blanket. Sherry realized her mother had passed away. She quickly took her kids and went to the neighbors to call the police. She had been viciously beaten. The murder weapon had been determined to be a hammer. She had also been sexually assaulted. It had been a brutal murder and one that shook the community. Detectives determined that the killer had entered the home via the garage and believed that the attack had happened sometime midday, as it appeared Patricia had been about to eat lunch. The home had also been ransacked and contents of Patricia's purse had been dumped out, and a hammer was found next to Patricia. Other evidence collected from the scene was blanket and the carpet underneath her body for later examination. The investigation had puzzled detectives. No one in the surrounding townhomes had heard or seen anything suspicious. They had just moved to Colorado, so they didn't believe that it was someone who knew Patricia or her family. The killer appeared to have just walked in and out in broad daylight without anyone noticing. On January 4th, a couple, Kim and Jim Habenshield, had a bizarre break-in and attack in Aurora, Colorado. The couple awoke to have been attacked by a man wielding a hammer. When the couple started screaming, the man threw the hammer and ran out of the house. He had also entered the home through an open garage and had stolen Kim's purse. The hammer had been a standard hardware store claw hammer. Similar to Patricia's murder, no prints were found, which led detectives to believe the attacker had worn gloves. The couple had been extremely disoriented when they finally realized there was a man in their bedroom. They hadn't even initially realized they both had injuries. They were both bleeding heavily but didn't notice for several minutes. They described their attacker as a large man, but it had been too dark to see any details. The man hadn't said anything before running out of the house. Officers traced footprints in the snow from their house to a neighbor's house, and it was theorized that the perpetrator had been going door to door, looking for homes that were unlocked. Then back in Aurora, Colorado, authorities linked another attack similar to the Habenshields that had occurred hours after Patricia had been murdered. Donna Dixon, a flight attendant, had been attacked in her garage by a man with a hammer. Her attacker had been hiding in her garage and had hit her on the temple as she'd been getting out of her car after work. The injury had rendered her unconscious. She had been found still alive by her boyfriend, who was a pilot and had ended his shift in the early morning hours the following day. He found Donna in their bedroom, covered in blood, with a huge injury to the side of her head. Donna had been rushed to the hospital, where she was able to recover, but detectives had to deliver the horrible news that she'd been sexually assaulted by her attacker. Due to how much blood was found in the concrete, Donna had been left for dead in the garage. It was estimated she'd been there for several hours, but it had been the cold Colorado winter temperatures that had saved Donna from bleeding out. When news got out that Donna lived through the attack, Donna's boyfriend was terrified someone would come back to finish the job, and he slept with a gun for months afterward. The first thing Donna remembered was waking up on the garage floor. She still had her house keys in her hand from when she'd gotten out of the car. She had no idea what had happened and started vomiting, which she attributed to drinking too much in the state of shock that she was in. She could only focus on how cold she was, both from the open garage door and the shock from the injury. She got into the house and made her way to the bedroom, where she laid down until her boyfriend came home. Again, a hammer was found in the garage, and Donna's purse had cash stolen from it. Then, on January 16th, the Aurora Police Department got a call for the most horrific and violent attack yet. Bruce and Deborah Bennett worked together at a furniture warehouse, and it was when neither of them showed up for work that morning that drew a cause for concern. The couple were always extremely reliable, and when their work called their house, no one picked up, which was also very unusual. One of their coworkers got in touch with Bruce's mother, Connie, and asked if she knew where they were. Connie also called the Bennetts, and when no one answered, she got in her car and drove. When she arrived at the house, she noticed the garage door had been left open. Additionally, both of their vehicles were still parked where they normally were. As she got out of the car, she got closer to the home. She immediately knew something was wrong. Deborah's purse had been dumped out in front of the home. Then she said that the door from the garage into the home had been left ajar. She entered the home and immediately saw Bruce's body in the living room. There was blood everywhere, and she knew her son was deceased. It had been such a shock for Connie, as the family had been celebrating her granddaughter Vanessa's birthday the night before. There were still birthday plates on the kitchen counter. Law enforcement descended on the home. Bruce was found in the living room, but evidence had shown that the attack had started in the couple's bedroom. Bruce had fought the attacker despite a severe head injury. Several spindles from the banister had been knocked out during the struggle. The fight had ended in the living room where Bruce's throat was slashed. Deborah's body was found in the bedroom. She had been attacked with a hammer and sexually assaulted. The couple had 2 daughters. Melissa, 8 years old, was found in the bedroom deceased. The youngest daughter, 3-year-old Vanessa, was found wedged in between the bed and the wall with significant injuries to her entire body, and in a shock to everyone was still breathing. Vanessa was rushed to the hospital where she was treated for a broken arm, skull fracture, shattered jaw, and several broken ribs. She was in a coma for days after the attack, and it would take her years before she recovered physically enough to leave the hospital. Both of the little girls had been sexually assaulted by the attacker. A mountain of evidence was collected from the home. Deborah's purse, DNA evidence left behind in both bedrooms. The knife that had been and a hammer was also discovered. It had been a horrific massacre, one that didn't make sense to anyone. No one had heard a thing. Law enforcement had estimated the time of attack, sometime between 10 p.m. and 5 a.m., and none of their neighbors heard anything. Bruce's brother had been at the birthday party the night before, and he remembered as he was leaving that the garage door was open. He went in and let Bruce know to close it before he left around 9 p.m. He left after that and didn't know if Bruce closed it before going to bed. It wasn't long before investigators tied the crimes together. With how investigations were conducted at the time, they were all given to different, so there wasn't a collaborative effort to find this man. We saw this happen with the investigation of the Golden State Killer. Joseph James D'Angelo, being an ex-cop, knew what it was like between different police departments and that there really wasn't any system in place to work cooperatively. This was why he attacked in different areas all the time and how he got away with so many of his attacks. In this case, there were key similarities between all of the attacks. The hammer, the high-risk, blitz-style attack, getting into homes via open garages, and stealing and robbing of purses. And in each of the attacks, all the homes had been in newly constructed subdivisions. An FBI profile was done of the unknown attacker. The FBI felt that they were looking for a young man because the attacks, all of the crimes had been messy. He'd left evidence behind, which led agents to believe this was an inexperienced killer. The attacks had followed a textbook escalation of violence, from attacking a couple and letting them live, to sexual assault and attempted murder, to the violent murder, and then the slaughtering of an entire family. The FBI also thought they were looking for someone who worked in construction, as newly built developments had been consistent with the victims. They also felt that all the victims were random, chosen out of convenience. Who knows how many homes he would try before finding ones with the doors unlocked. The attacker never broke into any of the homes, always entering where garages were open, and the doors into the homes were unlocked. The weapons were also notable. All the hammers were different. Some were older than others, some were construction, some were more of a basic home tool, and others were specialized. But he always brought them to the crime scene. The only weapon that had been used from inside at home was the kitchen knife used to kill Bruce Bennett. The crimes had all happened in such a quick succession, and the killer had attacked every week in January, and the communities surrounding Detroit braced for more attacks. But they never came. As quickly as the attacks had started, they just stopped. On January 26, 1985 in Kingsman, Arizona, Roy Williams was attacked in the middle of the night. An unknown attacker had come into his home through an unlocked back door, and Roy was awakened to a man standing over him with a rock in his hand. The man sent the rock crashing down onto his skull, but it didn't knock him out. A second blow came down, but the attacker dropped it, and instead of hitting his head for a second time, it landed on his chest, breaking a rib. Roy was able to get up and chase the man out of his house. Police came and investigated, but there had been little to go on. Roy couldn't identify his attacker because it had been too dark. What investigators did find was a very distinct set of shoe prints leading out of Roy's house. The shoe prints were so detailed, detectives could make out a number 9, indicating the shoe size. Their suspect had been wearing a size 9 tennis-style shoe. Officers in the area received a BOLO, which included a photograph of the shoe tread. And later that day, an officer on patrol saw a man hitchhiking and pulled him over to talk to him. They talked for a couple of minutes. The man said he was unemployed and said he was from California and looking to hitchhike back. Then the officer asked to see the bottom of his shoes. The officer noticed a similarity between the treads and asked if he could come down to the police station. The officer hadn't expected this man to bolt. The man was caught 30 minutes later trying to hide. He was identified as 23-year-old Alex Christopher Ewing. He was charged with attempted murder and burglary for the attack against Roy Williams. He was held in jail while he waited trial. 9 months later, on August 9th, Ewing was put on a prison transport bus for his first court date. The bus stopped for gas near Henderson, Nevada, and while correctional officers weren't looking, Ewing made a run for it. Law enforcement searched all night, but weren't able to locate the missing felon. Then, the following day, they started receiving calls from residential neighborhoods with reports of a man trying to break into homes. Then later that evening, they received a chilling 911 call. Christopher Berry and his wife Nancy had turned in for the night. The couple had 2 children. One was an infant, and Nancy got up to prepare a bottle. When she turned the light on in the kitchen, she screamed when she saw a man standing there with a broken axe handle. Nancy ran back towards the bedroom where the man followed and then started to attack Christopher with the axe handle. Nancy tried to help her husband by blocking some of the attacks. Both of her wrists were broken in the process. She also had a fracture in her arm. Christopher suffered extensive injuries to his face and jaw. Nancy had been able to reach for the telephone and dial 911. The attacker just kept hitting her over and over until she eventually pretended to be dead, and he suddenly left the room. Law enforcement again descended on the home in full force. Christopher and Nancy were rushed to the hospital. Their children had been unharmed. Christopher would suffer permanent damage from the attack and never fully recover. Ewing was not found that night, having eluded officers again. 2 days later, on August 11th, a collect call is placed from a payphone in Lake Mead, Nevada. The operator hears a portion of the call, where the man on the other end describes escaping prison and needing help. The operator then calls law enforcement, who rushes the area. Law enforcement, along with park rangers, spot Ewing still at the payphone. Ewing had called his brother. He was only wearing a pair of maroon shorts. He didn't look well. It appeared that the scorching Nevada heat had been catching up with him. He was sunburned, covered in scrapes and scratches. When Ewing saw park rangers approaching him, he tried to run, but he only got a few hundred yards away before collapsing. He was severely dehydrated and his body wasn't able to go any further. He was recaptured and he had multiple charges added to his already multiple charges. In 1985, he went to trial for the attacks against the Berrys. He was convicted of 2 counts of attempted murder, burglary, and escape, and handed a 110-year sentence. The charges from Roy Williams' attack were dropped because he was already sentenced to multiple decades in prison and should have stayed there for the rest of his life. However, in 2020, Alex Ewing became eligible for parole due to overcrowding, giving Ewing the first taste of freedom in 35 years. But what Ewing didn't know was that during a mandated collection of DNA from Nevada inmates, his DNA linked him to his crimes in Colorado, the murders of the Bennett family, Patricia Smith, and the sexual assault of Donna Dixon. The Colorado district attorneys scrambled to get Ewing extradited to Colorado so he could be charged in connection with the string of attacks from 1984. And after 2 years, he finally gets Ewing back in Colorado, eliminating any chance of parole for Ewing. Unfortunately, charges couldn't be brought forward in Donna's attack, nor his first attack on the Haben Shields due to the statute of limitations being up on both of those crimes. But DNA linked him to the Bennett murders as well as Patricia Smith, which the DA opted to try those cases separately. The charges related to the Bennett murders came first, since it had the most evidence. And during that investigation, they learned that Ewing matched the first FBI profile to a T. Ewing had been a high school dropout from Sacramento, California. He traveled to Colorado, where he lived there for about a year and worked in construction, particularly new builds. He had worked in several of the developments that he had chosen to find victims in. At the time of the attacks, he'd been 23. But Ewing hadn't been what detectives had been expecting. Ewing was 5 feet 6 inches, he had a small frame, and now 61, he had seemed quite frail. Hardly what they expected from a man they'd been searching for almost 4 decades. He didn't seem capable of the brutal assaults afflicted on his victims. But while they interviewed him, he had displayed seething rage, and the facade of the frail old man had disappeared. If Alex Ewing were to ever be released, they were certain he would kill again. He also had a violent criminal history dating back to 1979 for several burglaries. He had previously been in jail for those crimes, and he'd only just been released in 1984 when he started the killing spree in Colorado. The trial for the Bennett murders began in August 2021, and the jury deliberated for 2 days before coming back with a guilty verdict on all counts and sentenced to 40 years in prison. Then in April 2022, the trial for Patricia's murder. This time, the jury only deliberated for 4 hours before handing down a unanimous guilty verdict, adding another life sentence and eliminating any possibility of parole. There was a sense of relief from Ewing's surviving victims. Connie Bennett said of Ewing, "Some people may call him an animal, but I won't because I think animals have a purpose in this world." Vanessa Bennett also made several statements outlining the pain and suffering she had in her life due to the lasting physical and emotional pain she had been in since January 16, 1985, when her whole life changed. Spokane, once home to a native tribe, has grown into a bustling industrial town with stunning landscapes perfect for outdoor activities like downhill skating and mountain biking. Archie Rutherford, born in 1924 in Montana, spent most of his life in Spokane, where he met his wife Eleanor. They were overjoyed when their son Stanley was born. Archie had a deep love for art, especially stage plays, which led him to join the Spokane Civic Theater, established in 1947. His talent quickly earned him the role of a theater director, allowing him to lead many plays. Besides his theater work, Archie also worked as a night clerk at the Tradeswinds Motor Hotel and co-owned a drive-in restaurant with family. Eleanor, 6 years older than Archie, was also involved in Spokane's art scene. She helped organize music and art festivals. Besides this, she was involved in several philanthropic works, and this made her quite popular in the city. In particular, she worked as a writer for a popular newspaper in the city, the Spokesman Review. Eleanor loved her job, and everyone she worked with had only good things to say about her. Archie was supportive of his wife, and together they lived a very peaceful and contented life in the city. By the early 1980s, Archie was in his late 50s and Eleanor was a few years shy of clocking 65. It seemed to the couple that life would continue at such a pleasant pace for a long time. But they were wrong. None of them had any idea that a horrible, life-changing incident would soon occur. On May 22, 1982, Eleanor took a trip to Seattle. She had been planning it for a while, and when the day arrived, Eleanor said goodbye to Archie. She had no idea this was the last time she would see him alive. On her second day in Seattle, she started to worry. Archie had not tried reaching out to her to ask how she was. She was done with her business in Seattle, and that afternoon, she had her flight back to Spokane. She had different thoughts while on the plane. Most of them were centered on Archie. She wondered why she had not heard from him for days. It was quite unusual, and she was deeply troubled by it. These thoughts troubled her till she landed in Spokane. Upon disembarking, she expected to see Archie waiting for her. They had planned that he would pick her up at the airport. But when she looked around, she realized he was nowhere to be found. At that point, she began to panic. She thought that perhaps he had encountered something that had delayed him, so she decided to wait a while. The more she waited, the more anxious she became. When she could no longer bear the uncertainty, she made arrangements with a close friend to pick her up and take her home. As the car that took her home pulled up to her house, she noticed that her green 1979 Honda was not in the driveway where it was usually parked. The absence of the car meant that her husband was not at home, which puzzled her. She got out of her friend's car and headed towards the house. Something else caught her attention. On the front porch were piles of newspapers that someone had dumped there. In addition to this, a towel had also been carelessly thrown beside the newspapers. All of these things seemed odd to Eleanor. She could not make sense of what she was seeing. Much to her surprise, when she tried the door, she discovered it was unlocked. Did this mean that Archie was at home, or had he forgotten to lock the door before leaving the house? At that point, she did not know what to think. As she stepped into the silent house, she knew something was terribly wrong. The mess that had been outside the front door was nothing compared to what waited for her inside the house. The house was nothing short of chaotic, and things were all over the place. Steak knives from the kitchen drawer were scattered on the dining room table, and a colored television that was always in plain sight was missing. She took all of this disorder in at a glance and slowly made her way to the bedroom. As she opened the bedroom door, nothing prepared her for what she saw. Archie was lying motionless and naked on the bed. A television set was lying on the bed near his head, and its cord was wrapped around his neck. Archie's head and neck were bloodied, and blood covered the bed on which he lay. The wall of the room was also splattered with it. In addition to this, pieces of broken glass were visible near his head. There was no visible sign that he was breathing, and Eleanor hoped that somehow he would still be alive. But a part of her knew that there was no way he could have survived whatever had been done to him. She managed to calm herself enough to call the police and tell them what had happened. In a matter of minutes, the wailing of sirens filled the air as detectives from the Spokane Police Department made their way to Eleanor and Archie's house. A distressed-looking Eleanor opened the door and led them to where her husband was. Even the detectives were shocked by the brutality of the scene. They were unable to immediately determine that Archie was dead. Without wasting much time, the detectives set to work. They began to collect evidence that would be of help to their investigation. While examining Archie's body, one of the detectives noticed cuts behind his left fingers and forearm. These injuries were believed to have been inflicted when he tried to protect himself from whoever killed him. More pieces of broken glass were under his back when his body was moved. But that was not all. A piece of cast iron was also found under his body, and another was on the bedroom floor. The frying pan from which these iron pieces had broken off was later discovered sitting on a stove in the kitchen. When the pan was examined, strands of hair and blood were found on it. Detectives believed Archie's killer had used it as a weapon, so they collected it as evidence. When the detectives checked the kitchen, they noticed a bloody knife in plain sight. There were also bottles of whiskey strewn across the floor of the kitchen. In the bathroom, they found cigarette butts and ash discarded inside the toilet. Soon after, detectives completed a thorough sweep of the house, and Archie's body was moved to the hospital for an autopsy. From their findings, detectives had cause to believe that robbery was likely the motive for the murder. They believed this because Eleanor revealed that several items were also missing from the house, in addition to her car. The missing items included some of her jewelry, house keys, and Archie's wallet, in which he kept several of his credit cards. Detectives knew they needed to find Eleanor's car as soon as possible. They knew finding the vehicle was vital, since it would likely lead them closer to the truth. Information about the car was soon released to the public. Archie's autopsy results came in the following day. They revealed that he had been stabbed multiple times in the head and neck. An object had also been used to violently hit him on the head, resulting in a fractured skull and internal bleeding. Detectives believed that the frying pan found in the kitchen was used to cause this damage. Brother Ford was likely knocked unconscious by a blow to the head before he was repeatedly stabbed to the left side of the head and neck. Spokane County Coroner Lois Shanks told the media at the time of the murder. The possibility of Archie being asleep when he was attacked was not ruled out. Friends of Archie and Eleanor were deeply saddened when they heard the tragic news. They visited Eleanor to mourn with her and also to comfort her. It was a difficult time for Eleanor, and she needed all the emotional support she could get. Simultaneously, the detectives were hard at work trying to solve the case. To help the detectives in their investigation, several people who had seen Archie hours before his death came forward to say what they knew. A friend of Archie, whose name was not disclosed, told detectives that he and Archie had breakfast together on May 24th at a restaurant known as The Shack. The friend also revealed that he later saw Archie at work on the night of the same day. A police officer also reported that he had seen Archie that same night driving the missing Honda. As for the stolen car, it did not take long for it to surface. It was found the next day at a car dealership which was about 4 miles from where the murder had occurred. Detectives immediately examined the vehicle and found a fingerprint that did not belong to Eleanor or Archie. This discovery excited the detectives, who felt closer to solving the crime. The fingerprint was immediately submitted for analysis, but after several days of cross-checking it against the database, no match was found. This was something detectives had not expected, and they were left disappointed. They had the fingerprint of an unknown person who was most likely the killer, and they could not identify him. It was a frustrating time for them. After this, the pace of the investigation began to slow down, and it seemed as if Archie's killer had vanished into thin air. Days soon turned into weeks, and detectives made little to no progress with the investigation. However, when they least expected it, an incident occurred that allowed the investigation to pick up pace once again. Some of Archie's credit cards that had been reported missing suddenly turned up a few weeks after the murder in Kalispell, a city located northwest of Montana, about a 4-hour drive from Spokane. According to the police, one evening, 2 men had strolled casually into a radio station in Kalispell. They looked respectable, and no one seeing them would have thought that they were up to no good. The 2 men quickly made friends with workers at the radio station and were allowed to stay the night. This turned out to be a terrible decision because the 2 men had vanished the following day. Employees of the radio station did not give much thought to this until they discovered that some vital items in the radio station had also vanished along with the 2 men. It was then that they realized that the 2 men had been thieves. The incident was reported to the police, who took time to carry out an investigation. During the investigation, it was discovered that the 2 thieves had used Archie's credit card the night they arrived at the radio station. It was a significant discovery, and police knew that apprehending one or both thieves would lead them closer to solving Archie's murder case. However, they could not do much because they did not have the name of either of the 2 thieves. None of the employees at the radio station knew their names. Detectives did not have to wait too long for the name of one of the thieves to become known. This happened due to a random phone call Eleanor received from a stranger a few weeks later. During that phone call, the stranger identified himself as Bob Neville, and much to Eleanor's surprise, he had told her he had one of Archie's credit cards. Bob was soon found and interviewed by the police. During the interview, he revealed that a man called Jerry Provost had given the credit card to him. According to Bob, he had met Jerry in Spokane, and they had struck a deal. The deal was that he would drive Jerry to the state of Idaho in exchange for some cash. However, for some reason, they had gone to Montana instead. They had also picked up a local disc jockey along the way. Bob told police that he dropped Jerry off at Polson, Montana, and that was the last he saw of him. With this information out in the open, detectives knew exactly who they were looking for. A manhunt for Jerry began. Unexpectedly, Jerry turned himself in to the police. When he was interviewed and asked about the credit cards, he confessed that he had gotten them from 2 black men. Nothing ever came out of this confession because the identity of the 2 men remained a mystery. Soon after this series of incidents, the investigation died down due to a lack of leads and the case went cold. It would remain like this for many years. On August 18, 1996, Eleanor sadly passed away at the age of 78 without ever finding out who murdered her husband. Years passed and most of Spokane's inhabitants soon forgot about Archie's murder, but the detectives of the city's police department never forgot. From time to time, the case was revisited, but no progress was made. The case took a positive turn. A match was found for the fingerprint that had been lifted from Eleanor's Honda all those years ago. Detectives could not believe their eyes. The fingerprints belonged to a man by the name of Tracy Pruitt. The discovery was remarkable, but detectives knew they needed something more solid to be sure if Tracy was indeed the man they had been looking for. Due to this, they decided to take another look at the evidence that had been taken from the scene of the murder. The evidence they had were swabs of blood drops that had been obtained from the kitchen of the house the murder took place. There were also swabs that had been taken from Archie's body. All of these were submitted for forensic analysis. Soon enough, the results were out. There was a match from the DNA from the blood drops, and it was none other than Tracy. It was the final piece of the puzzle, and detectives knew they finally had their man. Tracy was not a stranger to the police. He had been involved in several criminal activities in the past and had even spent several years in prison for one of his crimes. In the same year that Archie was murdered, two women had accused Tracy of sexually assaulting them. He was arrested in Ohio for charges relating to the crime and received about 50 years of jail time, after pleading guilty to rape and aggravated assault. However, he spent only 27 years in prison and was then released. After he gained his freedom, he settled in California, where he lived an everyday life. But authorities kept a close watch on him due to his criminal past. On October 27, 2022, Tracy woke up not knowing he would be back behind bars before the end of the day. He was arrested in Los Angeles by Spokane police detectives, who also received help from the Los Angeles Police Department. After this, he was charged with first-degree murder and second-degree robbery. In addition to this, his bond was set at $1 million. At the moment, Tracy remains in custody in a jail in California, but he will soon be moved to Spokane to answer for his crimes. It took 40 years for Archie's murder to be solved, and sadly in those years, many of his relatives and friends passed away, not knowing who killed him. There are thousands of cold cases out there that might never get solved, and even if they do, the families and friends of the victims might not be around to witness the breakthrough in the cases. So, do you think the law enforcement agents are doing enough to solve the staggering number of cold cases on their hands? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section. Cincinnati, known for its Hamilton County government seat and the oldest baseball team in America, is also famous for its art scene and unique Mediterranean-inspired chili. It's also the hometown of famous filmmaker Steven Spielberg. Cheryl grew up in Cincinnati with her parents and two brothers, Bill and Dan Thompson. Everyone who knew Cheryl described her as smart, kind-hearted, and fun-loving. She had a cheerful nature that made people quickly warm up to her. She cared about everything animals, people. She was everyone's best friend, said Bill Thompson, Cheryl's older brother, to the media. When Cheryl was 19, she got admitted to the University of Cincinnati to study nursing. For her, it was a dream come true. Nursing was a profession she had always wanted to study. Since her school was in the same city where her parents lived, it was easy for her to shuttle between the two places. You always knew she was going to be the one that would grow up in a job of helping other people. It's just the way she was, Bill had said. Cheryl also had a friend by the name of Laura Bresser. Laura was someone Cheryl was comfortable sharing her secrets and fears with. Anyone could instantly notice that there was a strong bond between the two friends. Among other things, the two also shared a similar interest, and this was going to the disco every weekend to dance. We would dance together, which would throw people off. We were just having fun, just out there dancing together, Laura had said. Cheryl was living a carefree life without any worry. But things would soon take a dark turn. In the spring of 1978, the University of Cincinnati closed for spring break, and Cheryl decided to spend this well-deserved time at her parents' house located in Worcester Pike, Cincinnati. At the time, Dan and her parents were the only ones at home. Her other brother, Bill, was studying at a police academy in Austin, Texas. On March 24, 1978, Cheryl made plans to meet with her boyfriend at the Gatsby Disco, located at 3225 Madison Road, Oakley. They planned to meet later in the evening that same day. She also let Laura in on her plans, and Laura agreed to join her at the disco. It was all set to be a fun-filled evening. However, Laura soon called her back and told Cheryl that she had changed her mind about going to the disco. It was unexpected, and Cheryl was not pleased by this. I begged her on the phone not to go because I had a bad feeling, Laura said. Cheryl, however, did not listen to the pleas of her friend. She had made up her mind to go to the disco, and nothing was going to stop her or ruin her plans. At around 10:30 p.m., she said goodbye to Dan and stepped out of the house. She got into her car and made for the Gatsby Disco. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. Meanwhile, Cheryl's boyfriend had arrived at Gatsby's disco and proceeded to patiently wait for her. By midnight, he had grown extremely worried because Cheryl had still not shown up. Many thoughts flashed through his mind. He soon stepped out of the building to search for her. When he looked around, he immediately saw her car. It was parked a short distance away from the disco building. This surprised and at the same time alarmed him. He moved closer to the vehicle and tried to open it, but discovered that it was locked. To be sure that Cheryl was not back at the disco and also looking for him, he made his way back to the building. But after searching for several minutes and seeing no sign of her, he slowly came to the realization that something was horribly wrong. He decided to go to her parents' house. When he got there, he met Dan and explained everything to him. He also grabbed a spare key for Cheryl's car and made his way back to the disco. Upon getting to the disco, he moved Cheryl's car to a legal parking space and then continued his search for her. But there was no sign of her. It was as if she had parked her car and then decided to take a long walk into the night. After a fruitless search, the worried and upset boyfriend made his way back to where he had parked Cheryl's car. To his surprise, he saw the car being driven away by an unknown man and he immediately gave chase. However, he could not keep up with the speed of the car and soon lost it. His day just kept getting worse. First, his girlfriend had disappeared without a trace and now her car had been stolen. By daylight, the news of Cheryl's disappearance had spread like wildfire. She was reported missing by her family and authorities immediately began their search for her. Officers from the Cincinnati Police Department as well as Hamilton County Sheriff's deputies combed through wooded areas and vacant buildings. To cover more ground, a helicopter was donated by the Ohio Highway Patrol and it was used in the search. However, none of this yielded any results as Cheryl was nowhere to be found. Cheryl's car was found the following day after her disappearance. It was discovered on Bach Street, several blocks from the disco. After the car was found, officers began going door to door to ask if anyone had seen anything that could help them in their investigation. A description of her was also released to the public with the hopes that someone might have seen her, but it was all to no avail. It was as if Cheryl had vanished off the surface of the earth. Days turned into weeks and Cheryl remained missing. It was an agonizing period for her family and friends, and they feared the worst. On the morning of April 8, 1978, a game warden by the name of Mike, who worked at the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, was walking along the bank of the Little Miami River in Loveland. This area is only a few minutes away from Cincinnati. While checking the fishermen's licenses, he came upon something entangled amongst the shrubs down an embankment. On moving closer, he realized that it was the decomposing body of a dead woman. The woman, who appeared to be in her early 20s, was particularly clothed and was lying about 20 feet away from the river. She still had on shoes, socks, and jewelry, but her undergarment looked like it had been tampered with. There were also bruises on her neck. Mike was horrified by this. He immediately went back to his vehicle and notified the Hamilton County Sheriff's deputies. In a matter of minutes, officers arrived at the scene and secured the area. A closer look at the body revealed no sign of stabbing or gunshot wound, and the officer's first thought was that she had drowned. The body was soon transported to the Hamilton County Coroner's Office for identification and autopsy. The body was identified through dental charts as Cheryl. The result of the autopsy revealed that she had been raped, strangled, and had also been hit on the head with an unknown object. No one knew exactly when she had died, but the coroner who conducted the autopsy believed that she had been dead for about 3 days before her body was found. A rape kit was collected as evidence and stored at the Hamilton Coroner's Office. And since the technology available at the time was not advanced enough to carry out any analysis, there was little detectives could do. When Cheryl's family was told about her death, they were devastated and bitter. "It's got to be some completely insane person who's lost it," Dan had said at the time of Cheryl's death. "Someone who just doesn't know where his head is at." Since detectives had no leads, the case soon went cold. Years went by and Cheryl's family and friends bore the pain that her death brought them. Her parents died without getting to know who had senselessly killed their daughter. But her brothers, Bill and Dan, held out hope that their sister's murder would one day be solved. In 2010, detectives from the Loveland Police Department and Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation decided to analyze the DNA evidence from Cheryl's case. The evidence was sent to the lab and the result produced was a partial DNA profile. When the profile was checked against the database, it did not return any match. It wasn't something detectives had expected, and they were left scratching their heads for answers. More than 10 more years would go by before detectives finally got the answer they were looking for. In 2022, detectives sent semen from Cheryl's rape kit to a third-party genealogy company. The company made use of genetic genealogy, which involves using DNA to determine the relationship between individuals. The results identified a family tree. 3 people were singled out from the family, and they were a brother, cousin, and uncle. All 3 were located by the authorities and were told the reason why they were being investigated. The 3 individuals gave authorities their full cooperation and even agreed to submit semen samples for further testing. When the result of the test came out, it showed that none of their DNA matched the DNA of the unknown person who had raped and killed Cheryl. Detectives were astonished by this. However, the 3 men gave detectives a piece of vital information. And this was that they had a brother by the name of Ralph Howell, who had died in his mid-30s in a car accident back in 1985. With this information, detectives had a new lead. They decided to dig up Ralph's body, which was buried at the Rest Haven Memorial Park in Evendell. On getting to the burial site, Ralph's body was exhumed, and his jawbone was removed and sent to the lab for forensic analysis. All that was left was to wait for the result of the test. When the results finally came out, it was what detectives hoped for. The DNA taken from Ralph's jawbone matched the one that had been recovered from Cheryl's body. Detectives were overjoyed by this breakthrough. After more than 4 decades, the case was finally solved. "We couldn't have done this without science," said retired Detective Steve Moster, who worked on the case. Bill and Dan were contacted and given the news by detectives. "It was all a surprise," Bill told the media. "Everyone goes down the path of making their own ideas about what happened. And it was a complete surprise to me that it was a complete unknown person with no previous history to Cheryl, apparently." A closer look at Ralph's past showed that before his death, he worked as a newspaper delivery man for a newspaper company known as the Cincinnati Enquirer. It was also revealed that Ralph was a man with a criminal past. In 1983, just 5 years after Cheryl's death, he had tried but failed to abduct a woman. According to reports, he had stopped the woman by the side of the road and offered her a ride home in his newspaper delivery truck. The woman had initially been reluctant to accept the offer, but he remained persistent and she had eventually gotten in. To the woman's horror, Ralph told her that he wanted to have sex with her. He immediately placed a rope around her neck and began to strangle her. She had put up a fight, and after much struggling, he had eventually stopped the truck and let her go. Ralph was eventually arrested and he pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of unlawful restraint. It's not clear if he spent any time in jail for the crime. Apart from this, detectives also believe that Ralph might have been responsible for the death of 3 other women. The 3 women had all died between 1976 and 1978. They included 17-year-old Charmaine Stola, 18-year-old Nancy and Theobald, and 24-year-old Victoria Hincher. They had all been found raped and strangled just like Cheryl. From the 3 murders, the tireless work of the Loveland Police Department and BCI should be commended. They never stopped searching for Cheryl Thompson's killer, and now, over 40 years later, Cheryl's family has closure. Hamilton County Prosecutor Joseph Dieters said about the case, "I have prosecuted multiple serial killers. In my time as prosecutor, my office firmly believes he is another," he added. Even though Ralph was dead, detectives met with Cheryl's family and told them that they could present the evidence to the jury if they wanted further closure. The family agreed to this. On November 17, 2022, Ralph was indicted for 1 count of aggravated murder and 1 count of rape. Although there would be no trial, the indictment of Ralph provided Cheryl's family and friends with closure on the matter. For me, it helped finalizing it. Knowing that a person had been charged with the murder of my sister, Bill said. Whether he was dead or not, it really didn't matter to me. Laura was also grateful that her friend's murder was finally solved. She was a really good person. She didn't deserve something like that, Laura had said. "I really am grateful. Thank you guys. Finally that you got him," she added. What happened to Cheryl was heartbreaking. She had her whole life ahead of her, but never had the opportunity to live it. Many young women like her have suffered a similar fate, and sadly, many of their killers remain at large. Hopefully the long arm of the law catches up to them soon. This city is where ancient wonders meet modern charm. Visitors to this coastal town can enjoy both the calm of the seaside and the convenience of modern amenities. Swansea is home to Swansea University, so students are a big part of the community, making it one of the top 10 cities for student nightlife in the UK. And being in Wales, where rugby is a big deal, Swansea is no exception to the sport's popularity. This might be why Danny Dike, born in 1964 in Kenya, found himself in the midst of it all. After moving to the UK, he lived with his mother Suzanne in Friston Village, Eastbourne. Growing up, Danny developed a keen interest in sports, particularly rugby. He had a successful career as a rugby player and represented both Roslyn Park and Eastbourne rugby clubs. It was a short-lived career. A succession of knee injuries led to cartilage damage, and Danny was forced to retire from the game in his 20s. This, though, was not the end of his journey in the rugby world. Danny turned his attention to the study of osteopathy and became a qualified osteopath. Osteopathy focuses on a holistic approach to the body's healing process. Osteopaths use techniques that emphasize the physical manipulation of the body's muscle tissue and bones. These can include massage therapy for pain relief and the increase of tension on muscles to correct weakness in a patient's body. Danny made the move to Bryn Mill in Swansea, a popular student residential area, and started work in osteopathic clinics in Swansea and Neath. His qualifications also afforded him the chance to return to the rugby scene. During the 1992-93 rugby season, he joined the Aberraven Rugby Football Club as a physiotherapist. He began to thrive by being around rugby culture once again. Danny was a successful physio and enjoyed the lifestyle that many men his age yearned to achieve. From the outside, Danny's life seemed to be progressing rather well, with many attributing it to his hard work and dedication to his profession. But after he vanished in April 1994, police uncovered the well-hidden double life of the mild-mannered physio. On the 15th of April 1994, police discovered a distinctive red Ford Focus RS Turbo, unlocked and abandoned in a parking lot in the Brecon Beacons. There were no clues to be found in and around the car. Police later tracked the car back to Danny and launched an immediate investigation. Witnesses alleged to have last seen him alive on the 14th of April 1994. Interviews with those that knew Danny personally revealed that he lived a lifestyle funded by more than just a physio salary. He'd been doubling as a wholesale drug dealer. Initially, he started small, selling steroids under the radar to local connections at games and gyms. Occasionally, he would sell the odd drug to clubbers. But easy money comes quickly, and a love for money is the root of all evil. He soon moved into the big leagues of the drug underworld in Swansea. He made connections with suppliers from London. By 1994, Danny had dug himself a deep hole and had become a major drug dealer. He was sourcing drugs from the English capital and distributing the contraband in South Wales. By now, he had caught the attention of key role players. Little did he realize he was skating on thin ice. Although he had the connections to get the drugs, he didn't have the muscle to back him up if things were to go wrong. He was described by friends as being mild-mannered and overall a good guy. But in the world of hard men and hard drugs, Danny was at a disadvantage. Detective Superintendent Williams, who headed the case, announced that Danny's case was being treated as a murder investigation involving hard drugs. He believed that Danny had found himself entangled with very scary people, and his subsequent interactions may have been fatal. Williams added that it was possible witnesses to the crime were too afraid to speak up or come forward, which added to the hurdles in the case. For the next 2 months, police continued to investigate and interview possible leads. Despite their efforts, the trail went cold, and the case sat unsolved. This was until 2 months later. In June 1994, 2 men turned up at the Crockett police station in Swansea. John Welsby and John Wilson, both in their mid-30s and non-criminals, were seeking police protection from London-based drug gangs. Welsby and Wilson alleged these gangs threatened to snatch and cripple them because of their links to Danny. According to both men, Danny owed these London gangsters a lot of money. Ever since his disappearance, these dangerous men were now coming after them, since Danny had been using both Welsby and Wilson as couriers. This confirmed theories that Danny had possibly met his end at the hands of his connections in London. But it also left police wondering how much both Welsby and Wilson knew about Danny's disappearance. Police were still no closer to finding out what happened to Danny, but Welsby's background was an interesting one. John Jackie Welsby was born in 1958 and owned and ran a building firm called JKW Builders. He'd lived in Townhill, in one of Wells' oldest estates that overlooked Swansea. Welsby was no stranger to crime and had a long history dating back to the mid-70s. He had previously been convicted for dishonesty matters, burglary, violence, and rape. Since then, he'd been in and out of prison frequently. His interactions with other hardened criminals eventually made him many contacts. It also had the effects of making him a wiser criminal once he'd been released in the early 1990s. Through contacts within the prison walls, Welsby heard of the booming drug business and the money being made by dealers. He wanted a piece of the pie as well. Hardened by prison and armed with street smarts, Welsby climbed his way quickly up the ladder in the drug underworld. Welsby had a way about getting exactly what he wanted. He began dealing in cannabis resin across Swansea, Llanelli, and Carmarthen, building up his infamy along the way. It was then he was introduced to Danny in 1993. With Danny's contacts, Welsby would eventually have a greater reign over the drug trade in South Wales. The two developed a partnership of sorts, and soon Welsby became a wholesale customer of Danny's. By day, he was the well-known business owner, but in the shadows is where he made his real money. This was as much police knew about Welsby's connection to Danny, that is, until Welsby made police an offer in 1996. He agreed to show police where Danny's body was buried in return for £50,000, and a guarantee that he would not be sent to jail for his role as a money taker in Danny's drug dealings. Police were not prepared to negotiate with a man they knew dabbled in crime as a side business. Instead, they offered him £3,000, which he accepted. Welsby led them to Tanagrag Farm, where crime scene officers worked over a course of several days unearthing concrete chunks, carpeting, broken bits of a mobile phone, and fragments of human skull. Forensic specialists were able to obtain a DNA sample from cartilage kept by Danny's mother, Suzanne, after he'd had one of his knee operations. It was a positive match with the skull fragments found at the farm. After 2 years, police finally found the remains of Danny Dyke. Now they needed something more concrete to link Welsby to Danny's murder. Mobile technology was still developing in 1994, but forensic experts were able to track Danny's movements through call records from Eastbourne to Swansea. All activity ceased thereafter. The farm on which Danny's remains were found was at the time also being used by Welsby to dump building rubble. He allegedly paid £4,000 to buy the land the day after the murder. This was enough to bring 38-year-old Welsby, 39-year-old Wilson, and Welsby's older brother, 41-year-old Terence, to the Guildhall Crown Court to answer for their crimes. Prosecutor Christopher Llewellyn-Jones alleged that Denny was killed by the men following a dispute over money owing or a drug deal gone wrong. The trial revealed the gruesome details surrounding Danny's murder. On the 13th of April, 1994, Danny had called Welsby and arranged to meet with him in Swansea regarding the payment of a £16,000 debt. He left Eastbourne and drove to Welsby's home in South Wales. From there, both men arranged to meet John Wilson, a nightclub bouncer, at his home in Elba Crescent, Jersey Marine. Welsby was not someone who repaid his debts in a timely manner. Without much protection, Danny was ambushed by Welsby and Wilson, who beat him to death in the kitchen. It was a brutal death. They were allegedly joined by Terence, Welsby's brother, who helped them dispose of Danny's body. Danny's body was rolled up in a carpet and put in back of a van before being driven 10 miles from Swansea to Granswilt in West Glamorgan. The men dug a shallow grave and buried Danny in the plot Welsby had been using as a dump site for rubble. Welsby then arranged for Danny's car to be driven and abandoned at Brecon Beacons and wiped clean to avoid leaving any trace of evidence or fingerprints behind. This was done to throw police off their trail. In the meanwhile, Welsby grew concerned about dogs being able to sniff out Danny's remains. He became obsessed with covering up the crime. Welsby returned to the site with a concrete mixer and dug up Danny's body yet again. This time, though, he constructed a concrete coffin and reburied Danny in the newly made coffin even deeper than before. but the possibility of the body being discovered still troubled him. It was 2 months later. He returned alone to the farm and, armed with a jackhammer and digger, dug out Danny's concrete-encased body and got to work breaking apart the coffin he'd made. Afterward, he destroyed the body in a bonfire. He believed he covered all his tracks. There was nothing left of young Danny Dyke. Little did Welsby realize that crime does not go unpunished easily. Had Welsby not suffered a fit of greed, he may have gotten away with the murder. He unwittingly exposed himself by offering to take police to the crime scene, not knowing forensics could use DNA to link the skull fragments to Danny. The men turned on each other in court, blaming each other for Danny's murder. All three denied murdering Danny. Welsby eventually pleaded guilty, perverting the course of justice by assisting in the concealment and disposal of Danny's body. But the evidence was enough for Judge Justice Ebsworth to hand life sentences to both Welsby and Wilson. In sentencing, he described both men as selfish and cold-blooded. Terrence was released as a free man after it was proven he had not participated in any way with the murder of Danny. The blood police found at the crime scene did not belong to Terrence, but he was able to prove that he had previously done work at the house weeks before the murder and had injured himself. In 2018, the Danny Dyke case aired as part of CBS Reality's Murder by the Sea series. It garnered much interest by those who had been following the strange case over the years. But once a criminal, always a criminal, right? John Welsby once again made headlines following a drug-related arrest in May 2021. Welsby, now age 62, was released on license on condition that he did not return to his criminal past. It is not known when he was released from prison, but it did not take him long to get back to his old criminal ways. On a routine stop and search in the Mayhill area of Swansea, police stopped a Honda Civic. In the passenger seat was Welsby, his wife was the driver. After searching the vehicle, police discovered a bag containing 9.4 grams of amphetamine, along with 1,400 pounds in cash. Welsby claimed that the money was rent payment on the caravan he leased. Knowing the terms of his release, police followed up with a search of his home. There they found 7 kilograms of amphetamines worth up to 73,000 pounds, some of which was stored in a Jacob's Crackers tin. They also found cash, tick lists of names and figures, and scales for weighing. Messages found on Welsby's phone were related to dealings in amphetamine, cannabis, and cocaine, with amounts of how much was being bought and sold ranging from 1 ounce to kilos. Searches of the caravan he owned also turned up more amphetamine, along with cannabis and another tick list. An examination of Welsby's bank accounts showed that payments totaling tens of thousands of pounds being made into them. When he was arrested, he told police he was a soldier, not a cadet, and had been dealing drugs for the past 6 months at his own free will. Welsby appeared in the Swansea Crown Court in violation of his license terms in December 2021. At sentencing, Judge Hugh Reese said Welsby knew what he was doing when he returned to his drug-dealing activities. Judge Reese also said he was not going to give Welsby a lecture on the effects that drugs had on the community. The judge sentenced Welsby to prison for 6 years, giving him a 25% discount for his guilty plea. Welsby, whose health is now failing him, awaits a pacemaker being fitted. He will, however, remain in prison until a successful parole application is made. Depending on how one looks at the Danny Dyke case, there will be divided opinions over the fate of all parties involved. No one should be allowed to take another person's life, no matter the situation. So today we ask your opinions on the case. Did Danny Dyke create his own tragic ending by getting involved in drug dealing? Or should he have been given a chance to mend his ways? Did John Welsby have the right to kill another who was invading his turf? Was it greed or simple idiocy that made Welsby go to the police and uncover his own murder plot? Miramar's known for its tropical climate and stunning views, making it a top tourist spot in the U.S. Evelyn Marie Fisher was born on March 23, 1947, in Sardis, a small place near Chilliwack, Canada, to Charles and Ethel Fisher. She went to Chilliwack Senior Secondary School and later studied at Riverview School of Psychiatry Nursing. After finishing her studies, she became a licensed psychiatric nurse. In 1969, while working at a hospital in Vancouver, Evelyn met John Bamforth, a bartender. They quickly fell in love, and their friends could see they were perfect for each other. She was just great to be around. I never had any regrets about being with her, John said. A few years into their relationship, John got offered a better job in Grand Cayman, and due to this, he had to move out of Vancouver. Not wanting distance to be a barrier to their relationship, Evelyn made a sacrifice. She quit her job at the hospital where she worked, packed her bags, and traveled down to Grand Cayman to be with John. After settling down in the new place, the two eventually got married and spent the next couple of months enjoying a blissful and incident-free time together. With each passing day, their love for each other kept growing stronger, and it seemed as if they both had their whole lives ahead of them. But after only 2 years, Evelyn had grown tired of the place. She just could not see herself living the rest of her life there. She eventually spoke to John concerning this and also told him about her desire to move somewhere else. John had not expected this, but he knew that if she continued living in Grand Cayman, she would be unhappy. So he gave her his full support. She left me and she went to Miami, and 3 days later I quit my job and followed her, John said. The couple found accommodation at the Haven Lakes Estate mobile home park located in Miramar. They also both got jobs and began their lives afresh. Evelyn was happy and content, and so was John. In the blink of an eye, 6 years had gone by. At some point, a female friend of the couple moved in with them. It's not clear when exactly or why she started living with them, but she was welcomed with open arms. On January 22nd, 1980, John kissed his wife goodbye, left the house, and made for his place of work. The friend of the couple also went about her business, and Evelyn was the only one left at home. The day was just like every other day in their lives, and none of them had any idea that something terrible would soon happen. At the time, Evelyn had undergone knee surgery and had to take time off work to recover. But there was really nothing to worry about, and it was expected that she would be back to full health in no time. On the night of that same day, the friend of the couple returned from her outing. It had been a long day, and she couldn't wait to be fast asleep in her bed. However, when she tried the front door, she realized that it was locked. There was nothing strange about this because she knew that either Evelyn or John had locked the door since it had already gotten dark. She had no idea if only one or both of them were home. Not wanting to disturb whoever was inside, she searched through her bag for her spare key, but soon realized that she had not taken it with her when she had left the house. It slowly dawned on her that she could spend the whole night outside if she did not attempt to let whoever was inside know she was around. She knocked on the door and waited but got no response. It was dead silent except for the occasional honk of motor vehicles in the distance. She knocked again, this time calling out both John and Evelyn's name, but still, she got no response. Soon, she was banging on the door as loud as she could, but no one came to open it. With each passing second, she got more anxious and knew deep down that something was terribly wrong. There was no way no one inside the house would not have heard all the noise she was making. It was all so strange. She also tried other doors leading to the house, but found all of them locked as well. She soon decided that it was best to involve the police. She immediately placed an emergency call and told the dispatcher what was happening. In a matter of minutes, officers from the Miramar Police Department arrived on the scene. They proceeded to join her in knocking on the doors and even went as far as knocking on the windows of the house. But still, no sound was heard from within. After doing this for several minutes, officers decided to force entry into the house. It was the only way they could be sure no one was inside. The front door was soon broken down, and they all proceeded cautiously into the silent house. There was nobody in the living room and nothing seemed out of place. From there, they made their way to the bedroom. The sight that awaited them, there was nothing they could have been prepared for. Lying on a blood-soaked bed was Evelyn. It was like a scene straight out of a horror movie. The friend of the couple gasped at the sight before her eyes. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. Evelyn was motionless, and upon closer inspection, it was discovered that she was dead. It was obvious that whoever killed her had used an object to smash in her head. Police officers immediately secured the scene and began to perform a thorough sweep of the house. Meanwhile, John had gotten off work and was on his way home. To him, nothing seemed off and he was in a good mood. The night air smelled fresher and felt cooler than ever. From a distance, He saw the police vehicles parked in front of his house and was surprised and at the same time alarmed by this. He knew instantly that something was very wrong. He quickened his pace, and as he got closer to the house, he noticed the police tape at the front door. At that point, fear gripped his heart. Not knowing what to expect, he made his way over to the tape and into the house. Inside, he was greeted by the unfamiliar faces of police officers. And that's when I saw what I saw, which was furniture disturbed, cushions disturbed, and then I walked back to the bedroom. Half the bed, at least, was soaked with blood, John said. Evelyn's body had already been moved to the hospital for an autopsy. The police officers then filled him in on everything that had happened, and he could hardly hold back his tears when he was told his wife was dead. He was allowed to make a cup of tea to calm his nerves, and after that he proceeded to the station with some officers for questioning. At the station he told detectives everything he knew, and after what seemed like a long time he was allowed to go back home. The result of the autopsy conducted on Evelyn was out a few days later. It showed that she had been sexually assaulted and then killed by whoever assaulted her. Detectives were able to collect DNA from her body, but since the technology at the time was not yet advanced enough to run an analysis, it was stored for the future. Detectives began their investigation immediately, but there was not much for them to work with. John, on the other hand, was crying himself to sleep every night. He blamed himself for not being at home on the night that his wife was murdered. He believed that if he had been with her, she would have been alive. I had a lot of guilt at the time because I wasn't home when I should have been, John said. In February 1980, Evelyn's body was taken back to her hometown in Chilliwack and she was buried there. After the burial, some of Evelyn's family members blamed John for her death. Others even assumed that he killed her. It was all too much for the heartbroken John to bear, and he sank into depression. The whole tragedy caused a significant change in his character, and to deal with the pain, he began drinking and taking drugs. He also eventually moved permanently to England. From that moment to today, I've been a different person altogether because it changed the way I look at life, John said. It changed how I feel about other people because I was very trusting before. Now I'm not, he added. 2 months after the death of Evelyn, in March of 1980, detectives suddenly got a lead in the case. Here is what happened. A woman was sexually assaulted and almost killed in Volusia County. This is an area which is about a 4-hour drive from Miramar. The assailant was soon identified as a 33-year-old man by the name of Ronald Richards. Upon further investigation by the police, it was discovered that Ronald was living in Miramar. Due to this, Volusia County officials reached out to the police in Miramar to assist them in apprehending him. Ronald was eventually arrested and convicted of attempted murder and sexual assault. For the crime, he was sentenced to 50 years in jail. Miramar police, however, couldn't help but notice the similarity between Evelyn's murder and the crime Ronald committed in Volusia County. They began to suspect that he was also Evelyn's killer. It seemed very likely because he lived only 12 houses away from Evelyn and also had a weird habit of jogging at night. A closer look also revealed that he had a dark past. Back in 1975, before the Volusia County case for which he was jailed, he was convicted of manslaughter against his girlfriend. For the crime, he spent 4 years in a prison in Ohio and was released on parole in 1979. When Miramar detectives discovered all these details about Ronald, he was immediately moved to the top of the list of suspects in Evelyn's case. They did not have any concrete evidence to prove that he was really Evelyn's killer. And as time went by, the case went cold. The case was reviewed several times over the years, but nothing came out of these reviews. In 2021, Detective Jonathan Zeller decided to submit the DNA evidence that was taken decades ago from Evelyn's body for testing. After several months of waiting, the results of the DNA analysis finally came out. And it was what detectives had suspected all along. The result led them to no one else but Ronald. It was a major breakthrough and detectives were elated that the case was finally solved. It's a very good feeling, Detective Zeller said. It's also a good feeling for everybody that was involved in this case, for the family, in particular for Evelyn's husband, he added, because he was locked up in a prison in Ohio for a different crime. On November 30th, 2022, he was charged with the murder of Evelyn. "We accomplished a very important thing getting this indictment," Detective Zeller said. "This is the first hurdle, and the next step is a trial or no trial because maybe he dies in prison." "I don't worry myself with that," he added. John was also updated about the progress made in his late wife's murder case, and he was grateful for it. At almost 80, he had given up hope that the case would ever be solved. Despite the fact that Evelyn's killer was finally found, the pain her death brought remained with him. "I'm not a vindictive person, but I would certainly want to see justice for Evelyn. I don't believe in this closure thing. One never has closure." "You never have closure, as you can tell," John said. "But certainly is the most important thing. At the moment, Ronald remains locked up, but in the future he will be transferred to Miramar to formally face the murder charge. In addition to this, detectives also believe that he is a serial killer and that he could have had more victims than they know about. The murder of Evelyn remains the oldest solved cold case in Miramar's history. But thanks to the relentless efforts of the authorities, her family has been able to get much-needed closure. However, the hole her brutal murder left in their hearts will forever remain. Since Ronald, who committed the crime, is currently serving a prison sentence, what kind of punishment do you think he should get for the murder of Evelyn?" This next case will take us to the Bronx, a borough of New York that is often regarded as the birthplace of hip-hop music. It is also home to the famous Yankee Stadium and the largest urban zoo in the United States. On the flip side, the Bronx is plagued by gang-related violence. Jasmine grew up in Long Island, and according to her family, she was a very friendly individual who enjoyed having fun. She was a phenomenal singer, a professional singer. Jasmine's younger sister, Shauna Porter White, told the media she was very outgoing, and she trusted a lot of people. Everyone was her friend. "I told her everyone's not your friend," she added. By 1996, Jasmine Porter was 36 years old and a mother to a 4-year-old boy called Jeremy. She lived a peaceful life with her son in an apartment on Davidson Avenue in the Bronx. "We never thought she would become a mom," Jasmine's brother Derek Porter said. "She liked to have fun. She enjoyed life. When she did get pregnant and finally had the baby, she was a great mom." According to Derek, Jasmine was studying and had dreams of one day landing an administrative job with her degree. However, Jasmine would not live long enough to see that dream fulfilled. On February 5, 1996, authorities responded to a call from Jasmine's neighbors. They were concerned that they hadn't seen her or Jeremy for some days. When neighbors didn't see him go to school that Monday, they realized something was wrong and called the police, Derek said. When authorities arrived at Jasmine's apartment, they opened the door and found her dead in the front bedroom with Jeremy beside her. Jasmine had been dead for about 2 days when her body was found. All the while, her son had stayed beside her. It was a horrible scene to behold. He locked himself in the apartment with her, tried to clean her nose, wipe the blood off her nose, Derek recalled. The bond between mother and son is huge. He didn't leave her side, he added. It was discovered that Jasmine had been sexually assaulted and then strangled to death. This was obvious from the severe trauma she suffered to the neck. This was corroborated by Jeremy, who had watched his mother die in front of him. The son indicated there was a man sitting on top of his mother and that the man was naked, said Detective Robert Klein, a homicide investigator that had worked on the case. He stated that he tried to help her, but the killer was too heavy and that the man yelled at him to get away. Derek also spoke about what Jeremy had told him after his mother was killed. The person actually was going to strangle him, and he didn't. Also, at the time of Jasmine's death, she had been 6 months pregnant. Her death was a tragic loss to her family, and friends and authorities made it a priority to hunt down her killer. But after several weeks of interviewing people, the investigators found nothing. They were not closer to solving the case, and it was frustrating. The case went cold, and it seemed Jasmine's killer had gotten away with the crime for good. In early 2021, Detective Robert overheard a robbery suspect speaking about Jasmine's murder. This had been during a jailhouse call. It's unclear what the suspect had said precisely, but it was enough to spur Robert into reopening the cold case. But in the interim, I got a hold of the case file, Detective Robert said. I started tracking down people interviewed back in '96, and I also got a hold of the forensic biology report. It soon came to the detective's attention that scrapings taken from underneath Jasmine's finger had never been tested. This was because the technology to carry out such tests had not been available at the time of the murder. Detective Robert soon submitted the scrapings for analysis and patiently waited for the result. I knew there was a high probability that there would be the suspect's DNA under those nails, Detective Robert said. The first step was to obviously find that evidence, which can sometimes be tricky, but in my efforts to reach out to the office of the chief medical examiner and the people over there, they actually were able to find it. Took a while, but they found it. The DNA evidence led authorities to a man named Gregory Fleetwood. Gregory was a man with a criminal record. He had been convicted of strangling a woman to death back in 1987. And just like Jasmine, the woman had also been pregnant. For the crime, Gregory was found guilty and imprisoned. However, he served only 7 years in prison and was released in August 1994. The reason for his early release was that the murder charge had been reduced to a lighter charge of manslaughter. It was a shock that he murdered Jasmine barely 2 years after his release. Gregory's DNA was also linked to many other violent crimes of sexual assault, which took place over the years. One of these had taken place a month after Jasmine's murder, and as a matter of fact, it was right next door to where Jasmine lived. Gregory was soon arrested at his apartment in the Williams Bridge section of the Bronx and was charged with murder. After Gregory was taken into custody, he maintained his innocence by insisting that he had never met Jasmine before and had no hand in her death. He basically denied ever having known the victim, ever having interacted with her, and said that if for some reason his DNA was on her, that's a mistake that we made, Detective Robert said. The detective soon shared news of the arrest with Jasmine's family. When I called Ms. Porter White and informed her, it was very emotional for her, Detective Robert said. When we got the call, it was amazing that she wasn't forgotten. It's good work. The police department doesn't always get their dues, Derek said. Derek also spoke highly of Detective Robert, praising him for his role in the case. That detective, I have tears in my eyes when I think of Detective Klein. What he did for our family, he treated Jasmine like she was his own sister. Sadly, Jasmine's mother and younger brother, Jason, had passed away by this time and were not around to witness the breakthrough in the case. I can't think of anything that's more gratifying than taking a case that's sort of lying dormant for so long. Justice is at least on its way to being served. It's sort of the pinnacle of my police career, Detective Robert said. As for Gregory, who is now 66 years old, he could face 25 years to life imprisonment if found guilty of Jasmine's murder. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.